Hello, this is the seventh and final video for week 2, and it's on sex, gender, and sexuality, and it's very short. So sexuality is often conflated with sex and gender. In fact, I think we should really, instead of saying the sex gender system, say the sex gender sexuality system, because just as every society will have a system of norms around what one's gender should be based on one's sex, the society also has norms around what one's sexuality should be given one's sex and gender. So sex, gender, and sexuality work together as a set of culturally based expectations and roles within society. And again, every society might work that out differently. In fact, anthropologists have they sort of became interested in this area of sexuality and how it relates to sex and gender, they studied societies that have what came to be called a third gender. And those include the Hanif in Oman, in the Wiccan reading that you have. There are also groups known as the Hijras in India, the Bardash among North American groups, and the Mahu of Tahiti. So these are not the only groups, but they were key groups that were studied by successive anthropologists interested in this area. So as you read the article about the Hanif, and that's it's an unfortunate transliteration with that X, but it's pronounced like a KH, the Hanif. Just keep in mind, or as you read it, or as you go back to the reading and prepare for our discussion, think about how the Hanif in Omani society are not exactly men and they're not exactly women in terms of their gender roles and performances and expectations. There's something in between. That's why the word third is used, because it's really its own category. And another thing I want you to think about as you read this, first of all, is how they're a third gender, but then also how having a third gender actually sort of underlines the sex gender system. So when anthropologists first began to talk about these third gender societies, they would often say, wow, this really shows that sexuality is kind of open and there are more flexible systems of acknowledging and dealing with non-heteronormative sexualities in the world. But actually, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others who've read these third gender studies, we see that although the third gender is allowed some flexibility, actually the sex gender system for everyone else becomes maybe even a little bit more rigid. So I want you to kind of look for that and ask yourself what I might mean by that in the context of the Hanif. Okay, so sex, gender, sexuality, third gender studies. And the last thing I want to say about sex, gender, sexuality, and we'll talk more about this in our discussion, is that today, increasingly in the United States and in other places, we're talking about sex and gender as a spectrum or a continuum of sex, gender, roles in society, ways that these genders and sexualities are performed, a spectrum and continuum of sexual preferences, and so forth and so on. And this idea that every individual exists somewhere on that spectrum and continuum, and we're all at different places. And you can look for some of this in the Gabusi example. So in your readings for this week in the Nauft book, you'll see a lot of sexual activities and performances that seem to be part of the sex gender system and seem not to be. And we can talk about this in terms of this spectrum of preferences and performances within a man's life at different times in his life. So I want to spend a lot of time discussing that. But I have a question for you to think about here too. So we talk about this spectrum as a kind of an individual one. And is it also cultural? So again, getting back to the Hanif, does this third gender system kind of ultimately reinforce the normative system? And then also, based on everything you've learned about culture before, but already, do you think that culture sort of allows spectrums and continuums, or I guess the actual words would be spectra and continua. um, does culture allow for lots of different kinds of individual variations on a theme, or does culture seem to you to want things to be systematic and normative and might not actually deal very well with individual variation? It's just an interesting question that I keep asking myself when I come to this area of study, and I just want to know what you think. So please come up with some thoughts to share with me this week. Okay, thanks for your attention.